Hey guys, you're listening to the Wise Words Book Club, where we scale down some of the best non-fiction books and we give you their key ideas. We teach you how to apply them to the real world and how to benefit from them. So if you're looking to improve or looking to grow, then why not listen to some wise words? Words that make you wise.
So today we are going to be discussing the elephant in the brain. For the first time ever, I think we're going to just not do one review in one sort of podcast session, and we're going to spread it over two podcasts because it's just such a dense book.
It really is.
So I think the way we're going to do this, the book's broken into two parts anyway. So the first part's more about the theory of why we deceive ourselves and others, basically. And then the second part of the book's applying that to different areas of life, such as medicine, politics, humor, etc. So I think we're going to stick with kind of the theory behind it and the main points. Is that the plan, mate?
Yeah, pretty much. Just because there's so much to it. Like, wow, it's not even like the longest book, but every page just kind of is one of those life-changing, like mind-blowing sort of books.
So the way I sort of think of this book as well is it's a deep dive into human behavior, but specifically the behaviors that we kind of hide or we don't like to admit. So, as a disclaimer before we talk about this, I think some people might actually find this, like some people actually get annoyed by this sort of content because they think that the evil side, well, not even the evil side, but this side of human nature, which is like inherently selfish, is like a bad idea to spread. But that just doesn't, if it's truthful, just saying it's a bad idea doesn't like hide it or make it go away, right?
Yeah.
So this is just like an open discussion of how humans not only are they built on cooperation, right, but we're built on selfish intent and essentially lies and deception to a degree.
Yeah. I think like one of his main, like linked to that, one of his main points is when we look back through history, because we like to think of ourselves as quite like altruistic, as quite like selfless. We look at historical events in that way, when realistically that makes us overlook other areas in which competition or like progression would have come about from like selfish behavior. And yeah, like you said, I think some people might get annoyed because a lot of this book is about also hidden motives. So things that people don't know they do, or they do for a specific reason that they're not aware of. And like, obviously people want to know that they have control over their own bodies, but well, some of this might be contrary to that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm trying to find the picture right now. Here it is. So early in the book, he has a picture explaining like sort of the pretty motives that we really like to talk about, and then the ugly motives.
Yeah.
I don't have a very clear picture right now, or do I? Yeah, here we go. So the pretty motives, right, that we all like to talk about. We like to talk about human motives such as cooperation, community, progress, tradition, loyalty, altruism, truth. Okay. And then this whole book is like, yes, those motivations for human behavior, such as like we want to display loyalty to each other, we cooperate together, and that's like a very pretty way of looking at human behavior, right? And what he wants to talk about in this book is the ugly motives. So we're talking deception, we're talking social status, we're talking selfishness, we're talking sex, we're talking politics, we're talking competition mainly, which sort of in my head underpins that whole motive of deception and politics, because at the end of the day, you're trying to get ahead, right? You're competing with other people, hence you cheat.
The thing is that like I think a lot of these words have more negative connotations than should be given. In terms of like selfishness is basically just presuming that you're working primarily for yourself rather than others, but that doesn't always mean like as it can.
It's interesting because the whole point of the sort of the theoretical image of capitalistic society was this idea that selfishness can lead to net community gain. So like selfishly pursuing profits or creating a product that everybody wants, because obviously that's a selfish motive to make more money for yourself, actually benefits society as a whole. So this idea of selfishness as a really sort of bad motive, and if you're selfish, you don't care about other people, is kind of flawed in my head because it hides the fact that we're all, I mean, I read The Selfish Gene recently, right? And a lot of people just don't like the whole premise of the book being that we're basically biologically wired to just pursue our own interests, and it's kind of like a really bleak way of looking at human society, in the sense that it's just, his thesis mainly is that DNA is programmed for survival and reproductive of the self DNA, so not the group. And people don't like this idea that we are inherently selfish.
Yeah.
And I think one of the main theses of this actual book is that we are aware that people are judging us all the time, right? And we know that selfishness is punished culturally. Like, people don't like people who are selfish, so therefore we play up to these pretty motives of cooperation,
Yeah.
when in reality the ugly motives are actually selfishness. And I'm not saying it's purely selfish. I think this is one of his main points as well, is it's like, we're not this whole book isn't about like, right, it's all selfishness, it's only about that. But what it's saying, it's such a critical point that we all try to like hide under the rug, hence the name, the elephant in the brain, like the elephant in the room. um that we actually all are selfish. Like, yeah.
Yeah,
Or
exactly. Like, we're all individually, we're all like competitive, but the best way to be competitive is to work as a group. Do you know what I
mhm.
mean? It's like, so you're like inherently selfish individually, but for a way to that to like succeed, we have to like work together. And that's why this book basically goes into a lot of sort of ways in which, um, well, the human being, like the human race, has like developed sort of tools in which we can make it easier to work with each other and like sort of shun people that just try and jump the queue.
Yeah, sure. So before we jump into sort of like social norms and gossip, etc., right? I just wanted to retouch again on the thesis. So the idea that the people are judging us all the time, right? So because people are judging us, we're eager to look good to them in their eyes, right? So we emphasize all our pretty motives, the stuff that's socially acceptable, and we hide the stuff which is ugly,
Yeah.
like the competition. So um right, I think I'm going to jump into one of the things that I took from rereading it the second time. So he talked about, obviously we have the highest intelligence quota out of all animal species, and have the biggest brain per, like the biggest brain per body size, I think, in proportion, that is. And he talks about this idea of how this brain evolved over time. And he took there, for me, I got two things. He talked about ecological challenges, such as like warding off predators, hunting, finding new food sources, and adapting to climate. So this is basically this area of cooperation. So these are the elements of working together to hunt predators, to find new sword, and to find new food. Um, and which is obviously the pretty thing that everybody wants to think about. But then he talks about the other element of brain evolution in terms of um, improving brain size, was social challenges such as competition for mates, jockeying for social status, politics, etc. And this is the area that's potentially destructive because it's competitive. So like, his point was that many of us, like in general, would prefer the keys to our intelligence to be found in the pleasing light of cooperation, but in reality a lot of it was forged in the competition. um I don't know if you took that from that, or
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think like one of his points talking about how mating actually trumps survival. Our main idea, and this is like linked to selfish gene as well, is that our DNA is basically uh, like we're we're the shell to entrap our DNA, and our DNA just needs to be passed down. And so mating trumps survival. Once we've mated, then it almost doesn't really matter to a degree, which means that if you look at things like that, if you look at our main point is mating, then our motives for mating are going to be higher than others, as in like specific ones, like how, like what motives get us to mate, or so like social status or politics or power.
yeah, we have very intuitive ideas, right, of what it takes to be a mating success.
Yeah,
Like, we all know deep down what it takes. It's like, there's a few things where one is being, as a male, this is right. It's having some sort of level of prestige in the social hierarchy. It's being attractive, right? And we all kind of get this intuitively. Like, you don't need to read a textbook on it to understand that's kind of the way things work. So like, yeah, I think it was Jeffrey Miller. His point was, our minds evolved not just to be survival machines, but as courtship machines. um, and I think, on like a side note as well, he talked about, so this idea of competition, cooperation, right, and the three most important games that we play as human beings in relation to sort of reproductive success, etc. So sex, obviously, social status, and politics.
hmm
And this is kind of where all these ugly motives underlie it. And I think what's quite interesting, if you take it Rory Sutherland's point, is if you just look at capitalism or look at the society through the lens of these, you start seeing the reason for existence of certain industries. So like
yeah,
Tinder and stuff, but like displaying your fitness through pictures, right, and
yeah.
stuff.
It's playing on our instincts. It's playing on our motives.
Yeah, literally. And if you look at what's popular, it will show you the deep human instincts of driving. Like Instagram, it's just full of just people basically posting naked. It's like
Yeah,
soft porn in my
yeah,
head.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And what does that tell you about human nature, right? In my head, like, it's to me, it's pretty obvious.
Well, they're all just these sort of categories, and within them there are all these different types of ways of achieving it. It's like, uh, one way of like like attracting a mate would be to like be big and muscular. Okay, the other way is also to be like social, and within social there's loads of different areas like politics and trying to get coalitions, all those kinds of areas. And it's kind of like all these categories within categories within categories, and all of them are sort of like along a sort of path of a motive, if you get what I mean.
Mhm. Yeah, I think he made a really interesting insight as well. By the way, so it was he talked about obviously these are the competitions of life, right?
Mm.
Social status, politics, sex. Um, he talked about this idea that the same drive that makes us want to win these competitions leads to different strategies. So both the sociopath who schemes and the charming courtier are both following those motivations.
Yeah, yeah,
They're
yeah,
just doing it in different ways,
yeah.
which I find very interesting because basically all we do as humans is we are all competing in these things. We kind of know it deep down, but we just basically choose different strategies to try and obtain the the thing we're going after, which we're all going after, really, which is this idea of. I mean, the way I kind of try and think about this is, if you look at movies and media, what do they always portray? Like these heroic characters, right?
These archetypes.
Yeah, and we're all trying to live up to that, like these heroes. I feel like that all of us aspire to be that hero in that film who have people have like, for example, maybe if it's a male superhero, all the women are like down at his feet. If you kind of get me, like looking up to him, he saves the world, he's all powerful, right? We all kind of like dream to be that. What does that tell us about human beings in general, right? And it's in my head, if you are that hero, you're ticking off all the boxes, like the social status, the sexual like attraction from the opposite sex. Um, and it all kind of boils down to that, and you can map anything onto it, like literally anything, any type of behavior. um
I think so a good point to link it to this is that he talks about these two sort of hierarchies. So you have like the dominance hierarchy or the prestige hierarchy, and it's like how to achieve what you were talking about, how to get there.
when you're talking about hierarchies, you're talking about social status, right?
Yeah, exactly. So like how to get to that point of social status, like high social status. And so like a dominant hierarchy has different rules than a prestige hierarchy. Whereas dominant is like, you're constantly trying to knock everyone off to get to the top. But that also means that you have to therefore be you're paranoid about people trying to knock you off. Do you know what I
So
mean?
yeah, yeah, it's back to the strategies though, isn't it? If you think
Yeah.
about it, so social status, one's dominant orientated and one's sort of prestige orientated, and it's the strategy to get to the top of the food chain. Dominance is like power. It's like I'm going to take it by force almost, and I'm going to rule by fear. Think Stalin, right? I think that's one of his examples in the
Yeah,
book.
yeah, yeah.
Prestige is more like I'm going to be so charming or I'm going to be so nice to people, or like people are going to respect me, so they're going to put me to the top without me having to obtain it through force. So in my head, it's just two pillars of the
They're
opposite.
just two different ways of getting from A to B. That's basically it. It's like, yeah. But like within prestige, there's a bunch of qualities that like accumulate to make that. So like money, beauty, athletics, humor, intelligence, um, accents, kindness. Like there's so many different like ways in which to appeal to someone, and it's all about trying to a lot of this book is about how we try to appeal to people. And like most of the time we're not living in a dominant hierarchy. Most people are very like loyal, or they like to come across as a nice person because they're more likely to achieve more in life. um, and yeah, it's all about being able to take advantage of these sort of qualities so that people can so that we can appeal to people.
Sure. I think I'm going to step on a point I thought was quite interesting is that I would I would guess that the primary hierarchy was about. He makes a point that it was egalitarian. I can't remember how you pronounce it, but basically more like everybody
Egalitarian.
was egalitarian. Sorry, yeah, everybody is equal, right? But
Yeah.
then there's also the point that in the past, if you were, let's just say, a big burly bloke, you would kind of be the alpha male because your size would mean you'd win most fights. Not entirely true, but let's just go with it. But then I like this idea of the impact of weapons.
Mm.
So once weapons were established, the idea that because you were big and strong, you could be the dominant male
Yeah.
kind of fell, so you couldn't really take it by power. So I feel like this was almost like the rise of the prestige.
Yeah.
Because basically at any point now, once you have like first of all, it was like any weapon which could be lethal. You could then obviously overrun anybody. You could stab them or whatever. But then also the idea of projectiles, so you could not only could you harm people, but you could do it at a distance where you didn't have to take any damage. So this like changed the whole idea of like human hierarchy. And
Well, it was evening the playing fields, isn't it?
of course, yeah, it's like giving an antelope a machine gun when he's being chased by a lion. Fair play.
We'd all like to be, we'd all, we'd like everything to be equal, but at the same time, that's just not the case. And so we create these sort of tools in which we can, harness equality. Um,
Sure.
uh, Weapons being a perfect example.
Yeah, it almost kind of forced equality, because if you were somebody like a despot or power ruler, you could be overthrown at any time by a bunch of people who have weapons, basically.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, I thought that was a really interesting sort of development of the idea that yeah, the power, sort of this idea of like pure power kind of went down in its value as an evolutionary tool compared to weapons, which I almost would then argue maybe the reason why we got more intelligent was because we got better at building weapons and like reducing that power dynamic. Yeah,
which is kind of ironic because you gain power from creating weapons as well, isn't it? It's like what if you had a better bow and arrow, or the crossbow then beat the bow and arrow? You know what I mean? Well, not in Agincourt, but
yeah, exactly. And then you move into like guns, etc. Right, and
yeah,
now like it's quite interesting, like this idea of like game theory, where it's like he's got a gun, and you're going to act differently because knowing that knowledge that he could kill you, type of thing. And it's kind of that's why I think America's like, if you lived in America now, the whole idea of like anybody could have a gun, it will change the way you act to people in a confrontational situation, right? It's this idea that as long as you know what they know, um, you act differently. But anyway,
yeah.
that was a little side note.
I just wanted to touch a tiny bit more on like the sort of building of social status, because I think it's quite like, well, it's very relevant to anyone who's got in a social group or whatever. But just this idea that like depending on who you're so like I've written here, people who are very popular don't have to try as hard as like people below them. This means that they have more choice about who they want to socialize with. However, people who are less popular have to try harder and don't have as much choice, this meaning they offer up their friendship at a discount, which is obviously quite not the thing that you want to hear. It's not a very nice thing to hear. You don't want to associate as someone who's below someone else, and so you put your friendship up on like discount. But it depends what your motive is. If you want to climb the ladder, then there will always be someone above you, and there will always be someone below you. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
And so like certain like you're constantly trying to compete with that ladder, and one of those ways of competing or to getting one up is maybe discounting. um and like with all these sort of aspects of like um uh all these different qualities that build up social status that we were talking about earlier on, because they're constantly competing, because all these ways of like attracting someone is constantly in competition, it means that we have like the byproduct of like art or technological innovation or science, because all of those things are almost like bragging points. Do you know what I mean? It's like they're amazing in themselves, but they're also to attract something. There's a motive underneath. It's like, oh, I'm going to
Yeah.
be the guy who discovers the light bulb. You know?
No, agreed. There is obviously motives behind it, which is purely selfish. Like even he admitted it in the book. Like the
Yeah.
author was like, if I was purely doing what I do in terms of, he's a scientist, right? If I was purely doing what I would do for the ideas and advancing science, then I wouldn't get upset when somebody steals one of my ideas. And he was like, well, the fact that I got upset clearly shows that I want some, what's the word? Like, I want to feel like I'm associated with this, or
Yeah.
what's the word? Like, I own this idea, therefore, like, it was purely me, if you kind of get me, as selfish reasons.
Well, just the idea of him writing this book alone, like I think there was a point in the book where he was like, we are obviously writing this book, and it would be lovely to say that we're not doing this for any like personal reasons, but obviously you can't claim that, because writing a book is gaining social status. We're reading it right now, we're talking about it, their names Kevin Simler, and Robert Hanson, they're obviously getting projected in this. So obviously it's all to their benefit, but at the same time they're also teaching. So you have that added benefit of both.
Yeah, yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so I think the signaling thing is interesting. Is like it kind of links to social status in the sense that you try and show off signals to people, right, without being overtly so for back into the selfishness thing, you try and take an action and signal that it's not purely out of selfish motives, right? You ask somebody, oh, why did you want to become a doctor? They answer, oh, because I really like helping people. They're signaling cooperation, right? But then the idea of the signaling is, especially in that perspective, is words are cheap, talk is cheap.
Mm.
Like there are other motives behind that. So people send off signals that they want to send off, right, and they hide the ones which are probably negative. So in the doctor's case, it could be the idea that why do they actually really want to be a doctor? Okay, fine, they want to help people, but also they want a steady pay and they want to be revered as a doctor.
Yeah.
Um, but I really like this idea of signaling in that it kind of it's the way we communicate with each other, because we can't overtly be like, oh, I really want to do this or I really want to do that because of this selfish reason or because of this. You have to signal that you're not doing it because of that. So we all spend our days signaling things which are sort of pro-social. For example, like another one actually could be like you buy a really expensive car, right? You're signaling that you've got excess money because you spend a lot of money on that car, and somebody asks you like, why'd you buy that car? You're not going to be like, oh wow, I bought it because I want to show off that I'm really wealthy. You go, oh, it's a Porsche, it's a classic brand, love it, it's got good heritage. It's So you come up with all these great signaling reasons for why you've done something, and in reality it's not actually the truth.
Yeah.
um and then there's a really interesting one as well, mate. I didn't yeah, so I link it to back to us and our friendship. So there's a there's a way of signaling between people, between casual friends and really close friends. Did you get that bit?
What? So yeah, I think because he talks a lot about like sort of like relationships with people. If we're talking that like to climb the ladder, especially because we're in like a prestige ladder and we need help from other people, then it's how to appeal to them the most or how to stand out to them the most. And I think that's what you were about to say in terms of like friendships. Acquaintances, like friends will want to stand out from acquaintances, and so they will do something to grab your attention, to like make make you trust them more. Whereas like good friends want to stand out from just normal friends, and so most of the time they do this in ways of like insulting or
Yeah.
like playing around, but that kind of thing.
Yeah, I just find it so interesting how, like, yeah, with all your close friends, I'm sure this is the same for everybody listening as well as it is with us. You actually just insult each other all the time, and you're always like taking the piss. And yeah, it's one of these things though, mate, that you don't really think about until when you view it through this lens, you realize what it's about. It's about showing we're such good friends that I can rip into you about something, and you're not going to get upset about it because I know you so well that I can do this.
Yeah.
And it's almost like showing off, like.
It is. So is that then because, like, for instance, I've known you for what 11 years now or something.
Yeah,
So I know your motive when you insult me. That your actual motive is like to stand out and it's funny. I don't
sure.
have to take it from like on its face value.
Yeah.
Um,
But I think, yeah, it's almost implied by the way I look as well. So this is back to the body language. This is kind of like off topic, but like I make it out as if it is a joke.
yeah,
Like I say it, my tone and everything is playful, right? But I find it really interesting because this kind of brings up this idea. You know, when people meet somebody, they go, "He's come across way too strong," or "He's already joking with me."
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't like it. This is the people who are overtly friendly and have tried to take their friend strategy without realizing that it won't work on new people. So they start like giving, for example, I'm sure you've had the feeling as well when somebody starts taking the piss out of you too early on in your relationship, and you're a bit like, "Hang on a second, you don't know me well enough to do that yet."
yeah, yeah,
But I just find it was the only first time I ever understood that feeling, because I've had that feeling before, being like, hang on, like I don't know you that well. Why are you taking the piss out of me? Or like it takes you by surprise, like, hang on, ooh, why do they say that?
yeah.
Um
Well, I think like a part of this is, so obviously like we're friends, and that's like more like social status. but in
Mhm.
other areas of competition like sex and like politics.
Sex? What are you trying to say to me, huh?
What, you didn't know? No, sex is more like we're looking for mates. Politics
Yeah.
is we're looking for like allies.
No, but my
And
question
other,
was, are we in competition? Is that what you're saying to me?
yeah, of course we are.
Okay.
We're always in
Okay.
competition.
There you go.
So it means that like, how do we attract those kinds of people? And a lot of the
Yeah.
time, it's accentuating the traits that we want other people to have as well, that we want from other people. So like we push forward the things that we find attractive in other people, and we do this
Ah,
through like a lot of different signaling, like you said. Because I'm not going to like it if someone suddenly comes up and says, "Oh, I bought this brand new car because." Well, I just want to show off my wealth, but I bought this car and then we could go on a road trip. You know what I mean? It's like you're signaling different things.
sure. Well, there's a benefit to the second one.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think this actually goes quite nicely into sort of social norms to a degree because with the signaling, right? So an example of this could be a social norm that we all tend to have, right? Is um, if you have a lot of money or if you're very successful, you're not really allowed to brag about it. So what I mean by that is, with linking to the signaling, is there is a difference between a guy who has a really nice car and goes around telling everybody about it, like, "Oh wow, look at me, I just bought this brand new car," and there's a person who's really wealthy, doesn't buy a nice car, and he signals his wealth in other ways. Like he almost signals his wealth by not spending and not
yeah,
showing
yeah,
off. You
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
get me?
yeah.
And the idea of social norms is that we have expectations of the way somebody should behave, and when they don't behave the way you think, for example, if they're boasting about or over signaling about their wealth, we then tend to like punish them. If you, or we punish them, we judge them, right? And to be honest, I don't want to overstep too far into this because I want to talk a bit about social norms first. But the way we kind of we punish these people through social norms is through gossip and reputation, um, which I thought was a really interesting point, and it sort of explains so much of what most of our conversations can be about. Like
Yeah.
the amount of times I've just heard people just, do you know what? I don't like it at all, but like just chat shit about people all the time, just sort of bring up like what they're doing as if it matters to their life. But I
Yeah.
just realized what this is all about. This is all like political. This is all about trying to like shame somebody and establish like a norm within a group. So for example, if I said to you, right, "Oh, that person was doing this," I'm implicitly telling you that I don't think that you can do that. Like I don't think that should be allowed. And therefore I'm telling my group, like, this is my value, don't overstep it. So gossip's almost a way of
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I get you.
forging your own boundaries between a group.
Yeah. Well, I think to touch on his idea of what a norm is he talks about it in terms of like, I have an insecurity, you have an insecurity, and they're mutual insecurities. And so when we have collective insecurities, then we create this sort of norm, because most people don't like the same sort of things. Someone doesn't like someone boasting about money and those kinds of things. So we create these kinds of norms where it's not like an explicit rule, but if you do it, then like you said, there's shame or damage to your reputation. And those, so it's kind of implied, but it's not specific. Do you know what I mean? Um, and so I think like when you have that idea, then it's as soon as like a norm is put in place, you can see when someone oversteps the boundaries, but you
Okay.
can't. And
Yeah.
norms change with like time. Um,
Mhm.
and so as soon as you can see someone overstepping that boundaries, then you have that ability to, well, they're classified as a cheater, but you also have the ability to cheat. And it's quite interesting what he talks about in terms of this area, because to cheat, like to understand how someone cheats, you have to understand it, and then another norm is put on top to stop that way of cheating, and then another way of cheating arises, and then another norm is put on top of that to stop that cheating. So it's kind of like a
Well,
constant competition.
you're literally looking at the evolution of law
Yeah,
in my head.
it's
Uh,
literally this competition between cheating and then like constraining it. Do you know what I mean?
I, do you know what, arguably you could probably make a case for human progress in terms of capitalistic society was based on this idea of getting ahead by having an unfair advantage and then it being removed,
Yeah.
like just repeatedly over time, right? Like there was this, I can't remember what I heard the saying before, but it was something along the lines of like, you only make a fortune by pushing the boundaries of what's allowed, sort of thing, or like
Okay. Yeah.
by
Yeah.
by being a bit ethically sort of on the line, basically.
Well, it's, yeah, because like you could do that. You can see it so much in society now. It's in like, the government might put a system in place, right? But then the system, suddenly there's like a hole in it and someone takes advantage of that. So then they like patch it up, and then someone like finds a little hole in that patch, and then they patch it up, and it's constantly like, you're never going to be able to get something perfect, but there's always going to be people that take advantage of it, and people that then try and punish them for it.
Sure. So he gave a few examples of some of the norms that we like to skirt in terms of like we like to sort of what do you call, like, cheat essentially. So the main ones we do, I guess these are, you could call these like minor transgressions. So like dress codes. Some people like to avoid dress codes. Slacking off at work is another norm. Flirting inappropriately is one of the ones he says, and then acting politically in small groups. It's quite interesting as well. Um, it just goes to I feel like one of the most interesting things about sort of social norms, right, is a lot of people can go through life without realizing them, especially if you're not attuned socially, if you're not very good at sort of reading between the lines, because a lot of these norms are very implied. They're implied rather than said. Um, like, I mean, at the end of the day, if you really think about it, we don't get taught in school, right? Like law or like what's right and what's wrong. We kind of have a rough idea, and it's like almost untalked about what the idea is. And then you get a load of people who push the boundaries, right? I feel like that's what childhood kind of is. All these like teen, not crime. I'm not going to go that far, but some of the teen like life
Yeah.
or early adulthood life is trying to push these boundaries to understand where they stand. I mean, we'll touch definitely on in the second part of this. We'll touch on boundaries and humor, because there's a big relationship between pushing boundaries and using humor to do it. Um, but I just find this idea of we have these norms that kind of bind us together, because we as a group we decide what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Um, I just think the interesting about is about the punishment side of it is like getting caught almost, because what this book goes into is the sort of norm regulation. So how are norms? So we talked about it, like gossip, and we talked about sorry, what was the other one, mate? Can you remember?
Reputation.
Yeah, gossip and reputation, which in my head sort of go hand in hand,
Yeah.
in the sense that gossip can ruin your reputation. But one of his main points was, which I thought was interesting, is the perennial nature of gossip itself. So he says, in every big feature of society ever studied, there's always been people talking about people behind their backs, focusing on flaws and misdeeds. I mean, the way I see it as well, if you keep thinking back to what I said earlier about look at what exists and then use that as evidence for the instinct or the need for something, right? Gossip magazines, fuck me, there's like a whole industry based on chatting shit about celebrities, which might or might not be true, but people love it. So there's this idea that something about us as human nature we need to gossip about people to bring them down. So this is back to like the social hierarchy thing. We always need to be talking about other people, because talking about them, I don't know what must it do, man. I almost feel like it's like a sense of therapy for some
Well, it's
people.
like an over looming like sort of punishment that that will happen if you do it. So it kind of like a thing that he talks about here is it stops people's intentions, because norms don't work in terms of like punishing something that's sort of happened. It's trying to stop them before it's happened. So like, if I know that it's bad to brag about something in public, then I'm not going to do it, and so it stops my intention of doing it. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
Um,
Yeah. So we're regulating people's intentions. That what I
yeah,
think you're saying. Like, yeah. Um, yeah. So I think on the intentions part, it's quite interesting because we regulate, for example, right? Let's say, yeah, you're regulating all your friends around you. For example, let's say you're a close friend who's started flirting with a girlfriend. You're looking at through the
yeah,
intentions.
yeah,
Is he trying to
yeah.
actively flirt with your girlfriend? I think that's the example you had here. So is if somebody's friendly with your spouse or friendly with romantic intentions. So we're like monitoring for people's intentions. But the problem with this idea of monitoring for what people are trying to do is, as we've talked about this throughout this whole sort of thing, we don't actually know what we're trying to do. We're all trying to hide what we're trying to do. So they are trying to monitor somebody's intentions is so hard to do, and it's basically almost impossible. So we have to like go off very small information. um it's quite interesting as well. It's back down to signaling as well, right? So we're monitoring signals to work out people's intentions. So like this guy boasts about his car, you immediately know his intentions are trying to make himself plump himself up, right? Saying,
Yeah.
look at me, I'm a guy who's got a really expensive car. And then there's people who are a bit more strategic, and they will drop things in conversation, right? They're pretty much doing exactly the same thing, but they're doing it in a different way.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
we're monitoring for these intentions, or like we're monitoring for people who take these big leaps of faith to show off something. It's like, yeah, you monitor intentions. Let's just say somebody goes to the gym a lot and they've got a really great body. There's a difference between somebody who only posts pictures of their body on Instagram and somebody who has a really good body but doesn't show it
Yeah,
off. If you kind of get me. And we're monitoring for this. We monitored, he's showing off his body. That obviously means he likes his body, right? I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But what I'm saying is you're overtly being open that, like, I think highly of my body. And we are monitoring everybody for these intentions, which is interesting. Kind of side note, he doesn't talk about it, but it's just popped into my head. The idea of confidence. Because confidence is almost like showing you show the intention that you're not to be fucked with and that you back yourself.
yeah,
And that's why I think it's so attractive. There's something about it, like, because you can't quite pinpoint why they're like that.
true.
If you kind of get me,
Yeah.
maybe if they're really good looking and stuff like that, and they have an excellent body, like the face of confidence, right? You might be a bit like, of course they're confident, but I feel like this is kind of why, back there's this old school. I remember back at school, people used to say like, oh, let's just hypothetically say somebody's really ugly, no offense, whatever, and they are really confident. There's always a peak of curiosity. They're like, why is that guy so confident? And I think that's kind of like a level of intent. Like there's something behind him that's motivating, that's making that person confident. They become intriguing.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a complete side note, but yeah, the intention thing is interesting. How we all sort of like we monitor everybody for it. So I mean, especially in the mating game as well. Like somebody, for example, like Tinder, right? The intent's already there. These guys are trying to hook up. That creates a safe environment to promote. I don't know.
Well, people already know the motive. That's the thing. It's like the motive has already been like, outright sort of like, oh, you're not on here to make a friend, really, like realistically. So the motive is already being provided to you, so it kind of takes the weight off people's shoulders. And yeah, it's kind of weird because when, like, for instance, when we do like violate norms, we're our brains make sense of it as if it's
Yeah.
not that bad. And so I think people can get into bad habits of like, we all know someone who's like really cocky, and they come up with other excuses if you ever pull them up on it. It's like, why are you bragging about this? And they're like, oh no, I wasn't. I was just doing this, And that's the thing. It's like a lot of people, they want certainty to be able to call someone out on something. But a lot of these things, because like you were saying, they're all like, subliminal messages, signals. It's hard to have certainty. And so it's hard to pull anyone up on these kinds of things, and to like really, really put your foot down, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. No, it's one of these. I don't want to touch on it now because we're going to touch on it next week. But the plausible deniability thing as well, right? We kind of, the basic concept of plausible deniability is we signal something with the knowledge that you can deny the signal.
Yeah.
So you could be like, so I guess one way of doing it would be back to this car example, having like a really nice car. So a way of not making it plausibly deniable is like, look at my great car. Right, it's pretty obvious what they're trying to do here. But a way that's plausibly deniable would be potentially putting their car keys out on the table while they're having a beer.
Yeah.
And waiting for somebody to be like, oh,
you've got a Lamborghini.
yeah, exactly, no, literally exactly that. Which I find is interesting. Yeah.
Well, because things have so many connotations, and so it's not like you're not looking at it. You don't look at things in literal terms. You don't look at the keys and just think, oh, there's car keys on there. It's like there's so many things to it. There's a brand. What does that brand mean? What's the connotations to that brand? What does that mean? Oh, it's wealth. Wealth is higher up social status. Like all these kinds of things, you can link them. And so, yeah, like almost everything we do, like you're never going to be aware of everything you do, and all these signals that you put out there, because there's just so many. Like just putting on a t-shirt that might have like a nice brand. Like you might be wearing it for comfort, but at the same time, it's like, oh, but it is an expensive t-shirt,
Mm-hmm. I think also another interesting aspect of signal is kind of off topic for the book once again, but the signal is almost based on the receiver. Like if you're wearing a really expensive brand, but the person who's on the receiving end doesn't understand what that brand is, they don't know it's expensive.
Exactly.
So it's actually signaling is almost a way of making people in your immediate social circle or the people you want to attract be attracted to you. So the argument is showing off your wealth will attract people who are attracted to wealth. So It depends where you're at. It depends what you want from a relationship, but I don't. For me, that would be the wrong type of people.
So that's where he talks a lot about common knowledge.
Yeah,
If everything is like common knowledge, then you're reaching more people. But the same goes for like if you break a norm. So that can be quite like, or like norms in general. If a norm is common knowledge, then it's more likely to be enforced. Whereas, like for instance, you can have different norms from different cultures. So if I was to go over to Turkey and I did something that was completely normal here, but is completely off the charts there, then I'm more likely to be pulled up on it. Um,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. Um,
For like punishing, for instance, to make a norm, because obviously like norms come and go, but to maintain a norm it has to be maintained in like everyone's mind. Everyone has to still like uphold this sort of insecurity, and a way of that being happening is like punishments, for example. And the punishment can't just be done like by itself. It's got to be almost like, it's almost got to be seen as like a bad thing by society. You know, when you go back like 400 years ago, and there used to be like hangings in the street. You know,
yeah,
and it's a way of saying like this person stole some bread. This is what happens to people that stole some bread. And it's this idea of keeping in check these norms.
yeah.
And you hear about it a lot of times in terms of like drugs or anything like that. Like media does it a hell of a lot in terms of like keeping up these norms by saying, "Oh, this person did this, and this is what happened to them."
Interesting. Yeah, no, for sure. The media definitely helps with that. Like they almost they portray, they imply the norm by their headlines and stuff, right? In
Yeah,
my head,
yeah.
yeah, they
I've got a bit here. So I said the whole idea of norms is built upon common knowledge, but common knowledge isn't just the idea of everyone knowing something. They also have to know everyone else knows it as well. And this can be tricky when people come from obviously different cultures, like we said. Um, but a way of like acquiring common knowledge as well is just people with authority or influence, and they normally are more likely to be believed and is more likely to be seen as like, oh, this is probably common knowledge because this person is saying it. If the government, if Boris Johnson said something, I would take it as being common knowledge, and I would assume
Ah,
everyone else knows it.
by the way, you only know that because you know the amount of people that read the news.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I got you. Which is why, actually, that was Kevin Simler, one of the authors, did a really interesting article on that, and it was his point was the reason why big advertisement, you pay so much money for advertising on stuff like the Super Bowl, right? Is because it's the common knowledge effect. It's everybody else has seen that ad.
yeah,
So if it's showcasing a premium luxury item, now that everybody else knows it's luxury, so it becomes more valuable. So I mean, do you know what? It's an interesting idea, but I'd almost say quite a lot of products are based, or especially luxury products, indeed, have to be based on common knowledge. You have to know that other people know this is luxury, otherwise, what's the point of buying it? So that is why it's hard to break into some industries because you have to reach that common knowledge threshold where something actually becomes valuable.
yeah.
If you kind of get,
And like I think you start to see this idea of like, for instance, like if people cheat or take advantage of a norm, um, if you want to speak up about it, it all depends on whether it's common knowledge or not. So, like for instance, your incentive depends on whether what a cheater did is common knowledge. So, if no one else saw them, then you don't have as much incentive to speak up. But if loads of people saw them, then you feel bad if you don't, because then you also get judged.
sure, yeah. There's an interesting caveat to that as well. Is have you ever heard of the bystander effect?
I'm not sure.
It's a psychological. It was a psychological. I wouldn't want to say experiment, but I don't think it was. Basically, it's the case that a load of people heard the noise of somebody getting murdered, and basically did nothing about it because they assumed somebody else would.
Oh, okay,
So
okay, okay.
actually, there is actually a caveat to that. When everybody knows something, they assume everybody else knows, and they then assume that because nobody's saying anything, that there's a reason why they're saying nothing,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which is almost like
That's true.
stupid. But it's just how sheep-like our behavior is. It's like, wow, nobody else is doing anything. Like for example, somebody could collapse in a supermarket, right? And I think the interesting point was the guy who did the experiment said like to combat this, what you need to do is when you fall down, you need to point at somebody and say, "You call 911" or something like that. Because the moment you specify somebody, then they have responsibility. But when nobody has responsibility, they all just look to each other to see who's going
Yeah,
to act.
to see who has responsibility. Yeah,
Yeah,
no, it's
which is interesting.
yeah, it's kind of nuts really. Like, and like a way to like get, like for instance, with the whole cheating thing, I think a way that he talks about it is to make it vague, or like a way to get out to get away with cheating. First of all, is just to not be seen. You know, we've the reason why we can spot cheaters is because we've adapted to spot them. It's like a visual cue. But so like if we're not being seen, that's fine. But another way,
So I'm just trying to conceptualize this for somebody who's listening. Like we're talking about cheating the norms, right?
yeah.
Just in my head, just so I'm following it as well, right? So an example cheating.
So like cutting the queue, cutting the queue.
Yeah.
A basic one like that. It's like, if no one saw it, then no one's going to pick it up. Um, but then another way, like this doesn't really tie into the queue idea, but of like making cryptic communication. And he talks about this in terms of like slang or body language. And because going back to the idea of certainty, you're not sure if they did something or not, because it could mean something else, you know? Uh, yeah, so like there's a lot of ways around it, and it's through that
Yeah,
subliminal messaging.
I kind of want to
That,
build on that a little bit in terms of the cheating with the slang. Like I thought about this, and I genuinely do believe he's right when he says the motivation to create slang was to avoid authority or avoid judgment from peers. So, for example, the whole idea that marijuana is now 420 is just the perfect example of maybe somebody's like, "I'm celebrating 420," and like your parents be like, "What's 420?" And as long as they're not in the know,
yeah,
then you
exactly.
can
Yeah,
you can
yeah, yeah, yeah.
openly talk about things which would get you in trouble. So it almost evolved out of this motivation to avoid punishment and to game or cheat the system because because people understand intuitively that if somebody can't understand what I'm saying, then they can't possibly know what I'm talking about. Then you can get away with talking about anything. You can have code words, right? And that's half the reason why the Secret Service and stuff apparently use code words, right? It's all like, as even as a friendship group, you can make code words like, just to sort of hide what you're talking about from other people.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I thought that was a really interesting one. That one made a
because
load of sense.
because you're playing on the idea of common knowledge, as in like, I know all my friends say this word when we describe a certain thing. So then it's like anyone who's not in that circle, they don't
Hmm.
have that common knowledge, and so I'm
Therefore,
saying
they're not one of us as well. It's quite
exactly,
a good little
exactly.
bit of tribalism.
Yeah,
It's almost why the slang sort of proliferates is to sort of say who if you know what this means, you're part of the group.
yeah,
Um, kind of vibe. That's why language is almost like is actually if you think about language as this as well, it's actually a signaling tool to who's in your group,
yeah,
just like accents are as well. But yeah, that was I thought that the norm regulation, so trying to avoid norms through cheating, such as not getting caught, through basically changing the meaning of words so people don't sort of suspect you're saying stuff.
yeah,
And basically, I think the interesting point about the eye thing, in terms of being caught, being seen to be doing something, was this idea that how we are now wired to be really sensitive to people's eye movements. How often have you been sat somewhere, like this is to anybody, like looking into space, and you feel somebody's looking at you?
yeah,
Somebody might be. That's how sensitive we are to eye gaze, and that's because we've evolved to want to avoid eye gaze so we can get away with cheating. As weird as it
yeah,
sounds.
yeah, yeah. But that, like, going back to the idea that it's constantly this competition of being, cheating and then being caught. We make subtle eye glances to not be caught, and then we adapt to be able to see subtle eye glances. So
For sure. Um, Basically it's building into what we've already talked about, right? So I read The Folly of Fools, and his main thesis was this idea of a cheating slash deception arms race, that the person who deceives is being chased by the people who are trying to pick up the deception, and that this is just spiraling into more elaborate schemes. So the way he conceptualized it, apart from in human behavior, right, in animal behavior, right, there's a certain so for example, maybe the Venus flytrap looking plant which pretends to be another plant to eat flies, that type of thing. It has
yeah,
visual
that's a good
deception such
example.
as camouflage with chameleons, right?
Yeah,
And this is the way of just making animals, well, basically hiding yourself from other animals. And this is kind of what's happened with humans as well.
Yeah, like I think it's his like so his kind of main idea is this, this idea that we have our own identity and our own ego, and obviously we have like, there's certain things that can hurt our ego. Yet we don't like to seem weak in front of other people, and so we portray this other identity, this like social identity. And so even if we experience things, we basically it goes through our filter, it changes, and we modify it in a way to like make us seem strong, almost, if you get what I mean. So
Okay.
like, um, and the way we do that is our brains basically come up with these sort of like counterfeit ideas, going on to the next chapter, but these are ways of justifying and rationalizing these our reality to us. And the thing is, this all happens when we're like we can do this by lying. So we could see something and then someone ask us, why are you doing that? And we lie to make ourselves sound stronger. But the thing with that is that lying is taxing, and people can tell when you're lying a lot of the time. um, and so the best way to get around this is actually to believe it. And so the way this has happened is we've adapted, or our brains have adapted, to hide this from us. So certain ways we will answer something because we genuinely think that that's why we're doing that, or that's why we have that behavior. But in reality, it's a completely different motive and a completely different reason. Our brains have just confabulated it.
Sure. Yeah, no, what I thought was quite interesting is this there was a line saying to like understand the most important ideas in psychology. You need to understand the mind is divided into different parts, and for all the stuff I've been reading in psychology and sort of neuroscience now, it's kind of the common held belief now that we have like modules, like brain modules. And one of the interesting points about this idea of self deception, such as basically we can act a certain way and we don't actually know our true motives, which is kind of like the whole point of this book. You act in a specific way, but we don't actually know why we acted that way, or we kind of have a hunch, but we don't know for fact. And this idea of having different brain modules, so you have different, it has different functions. So obviously, you have a brain module which keeps your heart going. You have a brain module which helps with rational thinking, such as your prefrontal cortex. Um, and this idea that your brain actually doesn't fully communicate.
Yeah,
So your body, when it takes an action, isn't actually fully communicating what made them take that action. And then you have this other module called what they call the interpreter module, which basically then comes up with reasons for why you took that action, or it fits into a plausible narrative. And they call it the public relations module. So they talk about how your brain isn't just it's more of a public relations brain than anything else. Like as in you act and then you rationalize. Like it's always the
yeah,
same. Like
yeah,
we think
exactly.
we have free will, but we're actually what we're doing is we're post rationalizing after making a decision. So I think they're interesting. The interesting analogy they use is like you are not the king of your brain. You're the creepy guy standing next to the king, going, "A most judicious choice, sir."
Yeah,
Um,
it's so funny because it's like so true when like after you read all of this. Because so like with the interpreter model, they were saying that they were saying that for instance, to create these confabulations, they have to seem plausible. And a way of doing that is almost like spinning the truth or exaggerating the truth. They take bits of like your past and your memories and your experiences, and they mix that and they suddenly connect it. And it's very hard to then separate what's true and what's not. So it's more believable even for yourself. It tricks you and it also tricks other people. And like to add on the analogy of the king's courtship, the press secretary. I thought that's quite funny in terms of, there's someone in your brain who's basically taking all this information and they're like, shit, there's so many files everywhere. And then they have to take all the pieces of information, relate it to everything that is our sense of self, and then put our best, strongest face forward, um,
yeah,
which is quite funny to like imagine. But it's kind of scary at the same time because you don't know you are whether you're justifying something, or you're like actually explaining a reason that you thought is true, or whether it's like being confabulated. And a way that they say to like pick up on this is your brain always tries to fill in the gaps no matter how much like information you have. So the less information you have, the more likely you're going to notice them putting in pieces of information,
yeah.
filling in the gaps. And that's how you can stay aware of your press secretary in your brain, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you're right with this whole idea of like the less information you have, the more you have to draw from previous experience. So your brain then just creates sort of it gives it meaning based on what you've previously experienced or believe. Um, which is why you can never really trust your own motives. Which is kind of like the whole thesis of this book. And do you know what? It's just amazing how like it's just a humbling book to realize that we all don't really know what our motivations are. So we should really stop this whole thing we're doing at the moment where we're just judging people, saying like, oh, he was obviously motivated to be selfish, or he's motivated in a bad way. When in reality, this person might have had some motivation in that, but he has other motivations. We have multiple motivations. Sorry, and like even his point was like back to they used themselves as an example, right? Robin Hanson was saying like he really wanted to promote his ideas and advance science, right? But at the same time, he wanted to be selfish, right? So he was like, the point is, he does really want to get his ideas out there, but that explanation isn't the full
Yeah,
story. I
yeah,
think that's what we can take away. Like,
exactly. And it's never normally the full story.
no, of
We have
course not.
a habit of doing this in terms of just thinking something has one single cause when there's so many contributing factors.
Yeah,
Yes, there may be one main underlying motive, but there's always a bunch more. You know,
you've just reminded me of probably this is the last thing we'll mention, but there was that book by Hugo Mercier that I still haven't read, but I know the main thesis, and it was the idea of why reasoning evolved. Like how did reasoning come about? This idea that we can reason anything, and it was to convince others of why we'd done something. And once you realize that if reasoning came about to convince others of why you did something, then it obviously makes sense that it evolved to be the interpreter and it evolved to give pro-social
yeah,
reasons. If you kind of get
yeah,
me.
yeah, yeah,
And that was his main thesis. The whole idea of this idea, like that we can explain something to somebody else that's happened to us, is just our way of evolving the ability to communicate what we want them to hear.
yeah, yeah. No, exactly.
Which
Yeah. And
I
it's
thought
going to
was
be super interesting when we come to part two of this and actually apply it to different areas of the of society.
so. Oh no, I was going to rattle off a few here. So we talking about conversation, how speaking actually becomes a part of showing off, or like signaling
Mhm.
specific things, right? And then also we go into consumption. So what's the idea of like sort of why do we buy what we buy?
Yeah,
Like what are we trying to signal? What motives are actually behind what we buy? I think it goes into art. So why do we do art? Talk about charity, talk about education, medicine, religion, and politics. So it's pretty. Do you know what? I'm not even joking. This could have to be three, but we'll try.
yeah, it might have to. The thing is, a lot of them like lend themselves to other areas, and it's the same concept just plugged into a lot of different contexts.
Yeah,
So it's quite self-explanatory after the first couple. Um, but yeah, it's definitely worth. Like I remember the first time I read this book, the next like couple of months, I was just so aware of all these things, of all these sort of like you see someone else's behavior, and I'm like, I wonder if that is because of this motive or this. Are they gaining social status? It's kind of a weird a way to look at the world, but it's also quite like nice to be able to have that, be able to have that like sort of spotlight on it.
well, it's just do you know what I think. One of the things for me that it really does is it just highlights one the amount of humility we should all have,
Yeah,
and then two, it actually helps you be less disappointed by people because like let's just say somebody says something to you and that's not their real motive and then they fuck you over or something. You can now understand that like when somebody gives you a reason, it's not actually their real reason, and they're always going to give you the pro-social thing. So it actually basically makes you turn into a bit of an investigator. So you try and figure out what actually is getting this guy, what gets this guy going.
yeah,
And in my head, it actually will provide you a lot of protection from being fucked over in the future because you'll learn to not take people's reasons at face value,
yeah,
and
exactly.
you can learn then to sort of evaluate them more accurately in my head. Because this whole point of this whole thing is like the whole thesis once again was people are judging us. We need to figure out how to best present ourselves. But then it's the same for other people. So it's just realizing that we're all just trying to show off our best self. I mean, if you once again back to like looking at the culture and sort of seeing how this expresses itself in real life, look at Instagram. That's a virtual self. We are creating these fake versions of ourselves to showcase the best version.
Yeah,
If you kind of get
exactly,
me. Same with
exactly.
LinkedIn. This is literally it summarized. Like if you want to understand human nature, just look at that. It just shows everything to me. Um, and once you know all this stuff, it just basically makes a lot more sense to you. Look around the world and you can just think, okay, why did he act like that? Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Um, But yeah, it was a great book, and yeah, if anybody's interested now reading it, I would 100% recommend it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think
I think
that's a wrap.
yeah, I think that's a wrap. Okay.
There you go.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that, guys. If you did, make sure you leave a comment or a review. And if you want to know more about what we do, or you want to read any of our book summaries, head on over to wisewords.blog. And if you feel like staying wise throughout the week, why not follow us on Instagram at wisewordsummaries? I guarantee you'll love what you see. Anyway, guys, until next time, have a good one.